and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco.
Welcome to the Waco History Podcast. I'm Randy Lane, great-grandson of Waco architect Roy E. Lane. Over 100 years ago, he designed the Alico Building, Hippodrome, and other well-known landmarks. My co-host, Dr. Stephen Sloan of Baylor's Oral History Institute, is helping me learn Waco's known and unknown stories. On today's show, Waco's hometown hero, Doris Miller. Dr. Mike Parrish, a history professor from Baylor University, who literally wrote the book on Doris Miller, joins us to talk about Miller's historic story.
He helped save his captain, jumped into the water, and helped save the lives of several sailors who were struggling to swim.
And also to reflect on his legacy. And now, come with us on a journey into Waco's past.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos.
We got another guest in the studio today. Stephen, we have Mike Parrish. Welcome to the Waco History Podcast.
Thank you very much.
So Mike is a colleague in the history department at Baylor University.
Excellent. So we brought you in today to talk about Doris Miller, and you have a book here in front of you, so you want to tell us about that?
This book began as, part of a larger project. From time to time in the past, I've taught a graduate seminar on public history. The short definition of public history is history that engages the general public, history outside the walls of academia. Here in Waco, we have a project ongoing to create a memorial to Doris Miller, Waco's hometown World War II hero, a memorial that will include a larger-than-life statue, which has already been unveiled, a small park, an area where kids can come, tourists can come, people from the community and all over Texas can come and enjoy a little history and understand the importance and the inspiration that Doris Miller provides even to this day.
So I know some of the broad strokes of his story, but for those who don't know, can you kind of describe who he is? Let's just kind of start from the beginning.
Who he is. I love the way you talk about history in the present tense, which is not altogether improper because history lives.
Yeah.
And we cannot escape it whether we like it or not. He was an African American who was an unlikely hero. He grew up in very modest circumstances, part of a very poor family of sharecroppers who farmed land out near Spiegelville, land that is now underwater. There's no longer a Spiegelville, and his brothers and parents had a hard scrabble life, especially during the 1920s and 1930s, as cotton prices stagnated and then began to drop, and the Great Depression came on and created a lot of suffering, particularly people who were already struggling economically. He went to the old black high school in Waco, A.J. Moore Academy, as it was called. And he wasn't the best student by any means. He didn't like school very much. He was a hard worker. He had odd jobs in the Waco community. He sometimes worked in a restaurant, in the kitchen, and as a busboy. Most of all, he was known for his athletic prowess. He was a great, powerful young man. Even as a teenager, he began to become very, very proficient in various sports, especially as a boxer, but in particular as a football player. He was the starting fullback on the A.J. Moore football team. And so by the time he was 17, 18 years old, he was well over 6 feet tall, well over 200 pounds, and very, very powerful. Because he didn't enjoy school, because he didn't feel like he was really creating opportunity for his family, he decided that he would join the military. So in effect, he wanted to escape the Depression. And so he decided he would join the Navy. This was 1940, 1941, when he was inducted and went through training. The Navy was a problematic choice.
Yeah, can you talk about what it meant to be particularly African-American in the Navy during this time period?
He had a kind of romantic fascination with the sea and adventure. He joined the Navy to try to expand his horizons and to get away, but he knew that he would have to do very, very difficult work. Being an African American in the Navy was very, very challenging because you were at the bottom of the totem pole. Sailors generally, of all the branches of service, sailors have been subject to ill treatment and even abuse over the centuries, but particularly sailors of color. And so he was relegated to the worst kinds of duty aboard ship. He was classified as a messman. Mm-hmm. Which meant he was responsible for doing anything that any white person, either an officer or a regular enlisted sailor on board ship, ordered him to do. So he spent a lot of time in the kitchen, cleaning up after meals, collecting laundry. In fact, on December 7th, 1941, early in the morning there at Pearl Harbor, he was collecting laundry. Let me say this, too, that this was a different world socially. White people, particularly in the South, including Texas, white people could treat African Americans with disrespect and suffer no repercussion, no challenge. In the Navy, African American sailors like Doris Miller were disrespected to an extreme degree. Very few sailors and certainly very few officers even knew the names or could remember the names very well of African Americans on board ship. It was easy to dominate them and in many ways easy to ignore them. And certainly it was easy to take them for granted.
What do we know, Mike, of his career up to the West Virginia, or this moment on the West Virginia that he's known for?
Yeah. Well, he went through basic training. He was trained to work not only as a messman, but he had a battle station, as did everyone on board ship. And he was trained to service, so to speak, a gunnery crew, an anti-aircraft 50 caliber machine gun, make sure that there was plenty of ammunition available for the crew, which was all white. But he and several other African American sailors were part of this service subcrew to the gunnery crew. So he was trained in doing that. So he became familiar with the weapon that would eventually make him a hero at Pearl Harbor. He spent time stateside at various locations before he was finally assigned to Pearl Harbor, where the Pacific Fleet, most of the Pacific Fleet, in fact, nearly all of it, except for aircraft carriers, was there sitting, waiting, not necessarily waiting for an attack, but certainly vulnerable to a surprise attack there at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941.
Now, you mentioned he would have been familiar with a 50 millimeter, but we don't know that he'd ever manned one or been trained to operate one.
Yeah, 50 caliber.
I mean, 50 caliber.
50 caliber. 50 millimeter. That'd be a big gun.
Sorry.
He could have done some damage with that. Yeah, he was familiar, and of course, as a kid, he had grown up using a rifle. Yeah. They're out in the woods. He and his brothers would love to go hunting. They would, bring in small game to help feed his family, and he even dabbled a little bit in taxidermy. So he was familiar with firing a gun, and he was a good marksman. He had a reputation for being a skilled marksman.
I would also assume that if he knew how to properly feed the ammunition into the gun, that's one of the harder parts.
Yeah.
Pulling the trigger, and if you're a good marksman already, it may not be that far of a stretch.
Yeah. He didn't seem to be overwhelmed at all about manning the weapon by himself, doing his best to shoot at dive bombers and torpedo planes that were, buzzing around all over the place.
Well, we're kind of jumping ahead here.
Yeah.
Why don't we since we've kind of talked about his backstory a little bit, let's kind of run through the day. What would the day have looked like for him on the day that will live in infamy?
It was peaceful, and it was Sunday morning. Everything was quiet. There had been rumblings of a possibility, a Japanese attack, but intelligence people, diplomatic people, and the military on the scene, the high command at Pearl Harbor, both Army and Navy commanders, didn't take these rumors very, very seriously at all. And so they were almost totally unprepared. The fact that the Japanese did achieve almost total surprise in attacking the Pacific Fleet, which was totally stationary and vulnerable. The fact that they achieved total surprise really should come as no shock.
So I don't know that much about naval history, but I was in the Navy myself.
Oh.
I was stationed in Yokosuka, Japan, aboard USS Kitty Hawk. And from what we know from people talking about it and just the geography of actually traveling from Japan to Hawaii, it's quite a trek. And so I would assume that putting all your resources that far over stateside, closer to the States, would seem like something they probably wouldn't try. And so that's maybe why the people in charge thought this isn't probably going to happen.
It was a long, long way for a fleet to travel, particularly when you consider that there were scout planes out. The scout planes missed the Japanese Navy. There was a kind of crude effort at radar and other kinds of detection, which did not prove effective at all. A blip or two showed up on one screen, and it was considered to be, just a phantom effect. And so everyone was surprised when the first wave of planes flew across the islands toward Oahu. The best movie is not the most recent Pearl Harbor movie featuring Cuba Gooding as Doris Miller, but it's the 1970s movie simply called Tora, 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 which was the message that Japanese airmen sent back to the fleet saying, "Tiger, Tiger, Tiger." That was the code message for total surprise.
Interesting.
So events are going to move fast when the Japanese show up. But I'm interested in Miller's actions that day.
Yeah.
And kind of views around and perspectives we have on what he did or what he didn't do.
Yeah.
And of course, as a historian, I'm interested in the source material you got in as you try to tease apart what happened or what may have happened, what happened, and what might have happened. Can you talk a little bit about events that day?
Yeah, sure. He, as I said, was making the rounds, collecting laundry when the first bombs hit from overhead, and then a succession of torpedoes smashed into the West Virginia. And so the battleship, a huge battleship, very, very quickly began to sink, and it began to list to one side, and fires broke out all over the top side as well as below decks, and chaos reigned supreme. Miller tried, very, very quickly to get to his battle station, but he had great difficulty even getting there because of all the explosions and the fires, chaos, conflicting orders were flying, every which direction. And we finally got to the gun, and the crew was not there. The crew had been knocked out, and so he was the only one there available. And a couple of other junior officers were on the scene. He just decided on his own, with support from one of the officers, to take over the gun and begin firing the best that he could at the Japanese planes. There are eyewitness accounts. There are oral history interviews. So much is available on the internet now. There were newspaper accounts published very, very shortly afterward or long after the fact, virtually all the way up to present day, from participants who were very, very well aware at what was happening.
So walk us through it. So I want the minute by minute. He gets to his battle station. Yeah. Everybody's knocked out. Yeah. Some junior officers are there. Yeah. He's like, I'm going to man this gun. And they say, go ahead, I guess.
Well, before he could do that, before he took the initiative to do that, which was remarkable in itself, he was ordered by an officer to help the commander of the vessel, Captain Mervyn Binion, who had been wounded very badly and would shortly die of his wounds, helped drag his captain to a place of safety on the bridge so that he wouldn't be so vulnerable to the Japanese gunfire. He did that, and to his credit, more than any other person there, one or two officers, as I said, because he was so strong. He practically lifted up his captain on his own.
So he's lifting this guy, and we're assuming he's going up or down several decks to get there?
Well, he did have to go up at least one level and traverse an area that was very, very vulnerable, and bullets were just flying all over the place.
Wow.
Yeah. Once the captain reached a spot of safety, he continued to issue orders through the junior officers to the survivors among the crew, including Miller. But Miller largely took the initiative on his own to man the anti-aircraft weapon and begin firing it as best he could. Lots of stories, including some put forth by Miller himself as time went on, claimed that he not only, shot the weapon with great acumen and skill, but that he hit 1, 2, 3, 4. When he was interviewed after the fact, he would say, well, I think I hit one or two, and maybe, one of the planes went down, but I can't be sure. And then, well,
25.
And he was encouraged. Well, don't you think, the interviewers would say, well, I heard that you hit two or three, and and he would say, well, maybe I did, 2 or 3. And it's only human nature.
Right.
Yeah.
But the forensic evidence, and we were very painstaking about this, the forensic evidence about all of the Japanese aircraft that were brought down during the attack indicates that Miller did not shoot down one plane. The Pearl Harbor movie featuring Cuba Gooding Jr. shows him, shooting down, 1 or 2 or 3, and there are flames flying everywhere, and it's very sensational.
So not a single one?
No, he may have hit 1 or 2 or 3, but he certainly did not bring down a single plane. And of course, there's some irony and even a degree of controversy in all of this, in that people want to believe. People want to think that a hero not only demonstrated great courage and bravery under stress, but that he was effective. And particularly in the African American community, they are just adamant that, yeah, he did hit Japanese planes, and he shot down several. And the numbers are, 5, 6, 7, and maybe even he saved America from invasion by the Japanese.
I feel like we should give him a few.
Oh,
come on.
Why not?
What that view discounts, though, is that's the most important thing. I mean, and that's not the most important thing. The bravery that he demonstrated in doing what he did, and how radical.
Right. Yeah, he took the initiative, and he was cool. He was cool under very, very difficult circumstances. A lot of other sailors were jumping overboard, abandoning ship, and in fact, after he ran out of ammunition after about 15 minutes, because he was such a good swimmer, and believe it or not, a lot of sailors at the time were not good swimmers. In fact,
that's still a thing today.
Oh, is it really? That's too bad. All this water.
They do train you in boot camp, but you'd be surprised at the amount of people who come into boot camp and can't swim.
Oh, that's disheartening.
I want to go back to, I don't know if you've ever been on a naval vessel, but the ladder well to go from deck to deck is pretty much just a ladder. I mean, it's straight up. And taking somebody on my back up or down one level, I'm pretty much out of energy at that point, I would think.
That's right.
And that's just the beginning of his little tour of heroics, right?
That's right. There's a big push, not only in the African American community, but a big push among the people of Waco, and it's gone on for quite some time for Doris Miller to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. His captain, whom he saved and allowed to continue to command the vessel, did receive a posthumous Congressional Medal of Honor. And lots of other officers, mainly officers who were serving at Pearl Harbor at the time, some survived and some didn't. Lots of other naval personnel, I can't remember exactly how many dozen, did receive the Congressional Medal of Honor at the time. Everyone's white. Every one of them. And so this helps us understand more fully why the Navy resisted giving him any kind of credit, much less a Congressional Medal of Honor, for a very long time after Pearl Harbor. He helped save his captain, jumped into the water and helped save the lives of several sailors who were struggling to swim, and yet he did not get full credit at all for doing anything of that nature for several months.
I'm going to make some more historic assumptions. If you're firing a 50 cal machine gun from a ship that's listing, I would assume that would affect your accuracy as well.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. He was asked, after the fact, didn't you find it difficult to do all this exertion, all this courageous action, and then fire the weapon on top of that? He said, I'd seen the gunnery crew operate. I knew how the mechanism worked. I knew to keep the in other words, he was doing his job. Yeah, feeding the ammunition belt and firing virtually all at the same time. He said, no, I just pulled the trigger and she worked real easy. Yeah. So he kind of downplayed it, but the Navy, rumors began to circulate about this brave black messman. What's up with that? What happened? And the Navy denied that anything unusual had happened, but really put pressure on them to acknowledge the fact that Doris Miller was a hero. Was the African American press. The African American press in the North at this time was in its heyday, 1920s, 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. Truly professional and determined, and absolutely crucial to the civil rights movement, what historians refer to now as the long civil rights movement. We keep pushing things back all the way into the 19th and 18th century. When did the civil rights movement begin? Well, it began from the time that African Americans visualized themselves as not only free but equal and full citizens. And so that's what the African American press wanted to accomplish. They wanted to bring full credit to people like Doris Miller in order to achieve a bigger purpose. And that was equality and full citizenship for African American heroes, but African Americans generally. And so they put a lot of pressure on the Navy Department. They demanded, and finally the African American press pulled political strings. They contacted friends of theirs, particularly in Congress, who depended upon the black vote in the North. Democrats and Republicans alike depended upon the black vote, and finally, indirectly, but ultimately directly put pressure on the White House. They demanded action by the White House to have the Navy, first of all, acknowledge that it happened and identify Doris Miller, and then to bring Dory home. The Navy didn't want to call him Doris. They preferred to call him Dory. To bring Dory home and have him go on a tour. Heroes during the war were, very often brought home to help raise money for war bonds and engage in recruitment and that kind of thing, and to, just publicize the war effort and get everyone involved and engaged. And so that was the immediate purpose, to bring Dory home, have him tour the country, and ultimately to have him help fulfill the agenda, the goals of the civil rights movement.
So he's active duty. All of this happens on the Pearl Harbor attack.
Yeah.
How long of a time from that day to when he's brought home?
Yeah.
Because it sounds like it was quite a while. Was he active duty this whole time?
Oh, yeah. He was active duty. Not only did they want recognition and for Doris Miller to come stateside, they wanted him to be awarded, if not a Congressional Medal of Honor, a great honor of some kind. And the Navy did not want to do it, but finally relented and agreed to have him awarded the Navy Cross. And so he was the first African American in the Navy to receive a distinction of that level in its history. And he was awarded the Navy Cross in a ceremony on board the flight deck of the USS Enterprise at Pearl Harbor in May of 1942. Admiral Chester Nimitz, a fellow Texan from Fredericksburg, Texas, pinned the Navy Cross on his uniform. He was dressed in whites, formal whites.
I know them well.
Yeah.
I've worn them.
Okay. All the other recipients of awards, medals, distinctions on that day, of course, were white, and all the others were officers. And the photographs of the ceremony show the wreckage of the Pearl Harbor attack still in the background. It would take a long time for that to be cleared away. He became quite a celebrity from that point forward, very, very quickly.
Can you talk a little bit? I know, jumping ahead, he's going to have a short period of celebrity, but how that affected his life or opportunities that opened up for him, how it's received back home.
Yeah, that's a complicated story. Of course, was lauded by the African American community. In the press, he gave multiple interviews, and we managed to track all of those down. The thing that comes across was the fact that he was willing to embrace his celebrity and go along with the stories that were being told about him to a degree, but he didn't let it go to his head. He didn't boast and brag too much. He insisted on continuing a modest demeanor. He was willing to take advantage of the increasing opportunities. That's another thing the African American press and politicians wanted to do at the time, was increase the opportunities for African American sailors, to give them real training, give them meaningful battle stations, give them more responsibility, and eventually even consider the prospect of making them officers. And so by the late 1940s, early 1950s, there were several cadets at the Naval Academy who were African American. And eventually as well, desegregate the Navy, open it up with Truman, President Harry Truman's executive order around the same time, desegregate, in theory anyway, desegregate all of the armed forces. Every time the African American press would mention Doris Miller and take advantage of his celebrity and his heroism and point to him as a great American patriot, they would talk about these ultimate goals. And so, the title of the book is apt in that regard. Doris Miller wasn't simply a footnote. He wasn't simply what my dad used to refer to as postage stamp history, a minor character, an accident of history. He was a major, major figure. Everybody in the black community knew who Doris Miller was, and they lionized him. They praised him. They mentioned his name over and over and over again in connection with these lofty, lofty goals of desegregation and equality. And so he was a real vehicle. He was a real force. He was a catalyst for achieving the ultimate goals of the civil rights movement at the time. But the irony, and it's no surprise really when you think about it, is that white people generally did not know who Doris Miller was. And if they heard his name, they didn't care. They ignored the fact that he was a great hero, and they did their best to ignore the agenda of the civil rights movement. My dad was in the Navy during World War II. In fact, he was at Pearl Harbor on board a repair ship called the Vestal. It was tied up to the USS Arizona. And he was just a few hundred yards away from Doris Miller. I asked him when I was working on the book, doing the research, I said, well, what did you think of Doris Miller at the time? And he said, I didn't know anything about him. I'd never heard of him. The Navy didn't tell me anything about Doris Miller. Two separate worlds. Two separate worlds that persisted through the war. I said, you didn't hear about Doris Miller during the war at all? He said, no. Through the war, after the war, and it wasn't until we moved to Waco in the 1960s that my dad finally heard the name Doris Miller and understood exactly who he was. That speaks volumes about the difficulty of simply connecting, these two worlds for the sake of the civil rights movement.
So if the Navy wasn't telling anybody about this, how did the black press and other black people find out about this?
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, as I said, word of mouth. There were rumors, and the African American press was very, very persistent in, tracking down and verifying the rumors, and then actually communicating with Doris Miller himself, writing letters to him, sending telegrams, finally interviewing him when he did come stateside to go on the tours, pushing all the time. It took the press, it took politicians in Congress, and it took the White House, too, to force the Navy to recognize him, to award him, and to use him in promoting the very, very gradual but persistent goal of desegregating the Navy and providing, greater opportunities for African American sailors. There's a theory in social science called interest convergence. It applies to race theory in the United States, the notion of converging interests. The Navy finally realized that it was in their best interest to agree to gradual desegregation. And that's what happened throughout the military, throughout all the branches of the military. They finally realized that And this has happened. This is a persistent pattern in American wars throughout history. The realization that we need manpower and that African Americans can make good soldiers and sailors, and that they can even, if trained properly like white soldiers and white sailors, they can command. There was a convergence of interests in that regard. You can be cynical and say, well, it wouldn't have happened unless they realized it was to their advantage. The African-American community, African-American leaders, civil rights leaders were willing to take whatever they could get and to take advantage of opportunity to press forward, to achieve desegregation and to continue to push for equality and full citizenship. Yeah.
I would say that their goals were at least somewhat realized, because I will often tell people that my education in diversity was best when I was in the Navy, because the places I've lived have not been nearly as diverse as the Navy. I've had several really good African-American leaders while I was in the Navy, and they are fully competent and fully equal to all of the white counterparts, in my opinion.
No doubt the military has done the best job of socialization in diversity and equal opportunity. There's no question about that. And as I mentioned earlier, Doris Miller took the opportunity to get some training as part of a gunnery crew using a larger anti-aircraft weapon, because he was such a good marksman. And so that was quite a step up for him. But his ambition didn't really go much beyond that. And he had a lot of concerns about the effects of his heroism and celebrity upon his fellow black sailors. He was worried that they would be jealous, and he was worried that white sailors would be even more jealous and might prove dangerous to him. When he was home on leave a little later on, he told people that he didn't expect to return. He didn't think he would come back. People asked him, well, why not? And he said, well, I'm not necessarily too popular on board ship. Very, very interesting and sad and tragic to a degree. So that gives you an idea of just how far the Navy and society needed to go to fully integrate African-American sailors into a crew.
And of course, the sad news there is Miller doesn't come back.
He doesn't come back.
Can you share just?
Yeah, he wasn't harmed by fellow crew members. He died in the line of duty November 1943 on board a small aircraft carrier. It was built very cheaply, very quickly, and there were lots of them built at the time. A so-called baby carrier, the Liscum Bay was what it was called. In the heat of the island hopping campaigns by the Navy at a particularly vicious place called Tarawa. Strangely, my dad was also at Tarawa. He was a naval officer who was attached to the Marines as a spotter, and so he carried a radio with him during a Marine landing. I think during the second wave or maybe the third wave of Marines that landed at Tarawa. He carried a grid map with him, and he delivered orders to Navy dive bombers. Tarawa had been bombed earlier by naval artillery, but the Japanese were very well dug in. The most menacing thing to American ships in the vicinity, however, were a few Japanese submarines. And so the Liscum Bay carried not only aircraft on its flight deck, but also it carried a lot of munitions, a lot of, very, very explosive munitions. And one torpedo was all it took to sink this small carrier. It was the biggest loss of life other than the Arizona in the history of the Navy at any time during World War II or otherwise. Over 600 naval personnel were lost, and there were a few hundred survivors, but Doris Miller was not one. He was lost in action and presumed dead. In a really cruel twist of fate, his parents received the news in the form of a telegram that arrived on December 7th, 1943. And they were absolutely devastated. This helped to really harden the attitude of Doris Miller's father, Connery Miller, about the prospect of the civil rights movement achieving full equality for African Americans. He simply, did not have much faith. He saw too much racism, too much resistance in order to be very optimistic. And there were many African Americans who felt the same way. They felt that, despite what, might appear as progress, they felt that there was just so much resistance and that it was entrenched and that there was very, very little hope. Even after the war in the late 1940s, that there was, very, very little hope. Again, I say this with regard to Doris Miller's father because, he had lost his son.
Right.
So he was not optimistic about the future. Other African Americans, particularly African American leaders, were, absolutely determined to continue to press the military and to use the military as, a major first step in this civil rights struggle, this civil rights movement, which really, reached a lot of momentum during the 1950s with the emergence of Martin Luther King and other African American leaders, achieved a crescendo during the 1960s. The argument in the book is that there is a straight line. There is a straight line from African American slaves all the way back into the 17th century who resisted oppression and exploitation and violence all the way through Crispus Attucks in the American Revolution, taking up arms in service to their country, in a cause that we consider to be patriotic, through the Civil War, when nearly 200,000 African Americans served in the Union forces to help save the Union and to gain the emancipation of 4 million slaves and, see a major step forward in the struggle for equality during Reconstruction, all the way through World War I, when, again, even the Spanish-American War, when African Americans participated in the military. In other words, the military again and again and again has offered opportunity for service and momentum to push forward the civil rights movement. And so Doris Miller is very much a part of that story. Yeah.
And so when did the city of Waco start really grabbing onto that story and having it something that they really take to heart? And you see it all over the place in town now. Yeah.
Well, it's been, I think it's been 7 or 8 years now that we've been working on this memorial project. The really, fascinating and beautiful part of it is that it's involved people from all over the community, white and black, in deciding upon the design and the construction and the production of the memorial. It was a collaborative effort. So people felt involved, they felt invested, they felt respected. They had, an impact every step of the way in a project that has been off and on again, rather halting in many respects, but everyone is confident that it will happen.
Earlier I was asking you, Doris Miller lives 24 years. So, the life of Doris Miller and even the events of his life are very brief. And so there's that story, but then there's the story of the meaning of the life of Doris Miller and what he did and the way different communities, that's what the book brings out. Different communities have placed meaning on that.
Right. The one way you can look at it is the fact that, fortunately, here in Waco, we don't have a Confederate statue, which is rather surprising because Waco was and still is in many ways a decidedly Southern town with very, very strong traditions going back all the way to, before the Civil War. So we don't have that to argue over, have to make decisions about, which makes it even happier to think that we have the opportunity to do something that's very, very positive and frankly very, very serious in its ramifications, to really reinforce and dramatize the message of Doris Miller. What kind of message can we draw from his life and the impact that he made on the civil rights movement? What kind of message can we draw from the impact that, frankly, he has made and continues to make and will make on Waco. When the dedication does occur in December, it should and it will be a national story. The media will come from all over the country. And Waco will receive a lot of very, very positive publicity, and it will help sustain the kind of recognition that Doris Miller does deserve. When the original price tag of the memorial was put forth 7 or 8 years ago, it was about $1 million. And I thought at the time, that's a lot of money. First of all, where is that money coming from? Well, it's been raised from private sources. We met with former Congressman Chet Edwards a couple of years ago about, ideas to help us raise money, and he came up with some really good ideas. But he said, if this were the 1990s, all I would have to do is make a speech on the floor. When he was in Congress, the money would appear instantly. But the good old days are gone. And so $1 million, I thought that's a lot of money. And now it's about $1.5 million. And we're not there yet. But you can't really put a price on what this will do.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking about it, I mean, we still need Doris Miller.
Absolutely, we need Doris Miller. Yeah. What we need to do is not only as people here in Waco and Central Texas to take advantage of Doris Miller, to raise our visibility and our reputation, but to embrace him. Mm-hmm. And in the process, embrace everyone in the Waco and Central Texas area, and to engage with one another. I can't imagine the number of school kids that will come to the memorial, tourists, people from all over the country. I like to think that it will be able to take advantage of the Magnolia effect. Where do you go in Waco? What is there to see? Go downtown to the food trucks, go shopping and walk across the suspension bridge to, the Doris Miller Memorial and enjoy the park, but they're on the river, and learn little bit more about Waco's past and how, we're moving forward. We're pressing forward. We're part of a movement. We're part of a trend. We're not simply proud. We know how to take action and make a difference and make a statement and, create opportunity and understanding and relationships with one another.
So I have an interesting point. It's going to take a second to be made, but stick with me.
Okay.
So I'm going to bring some Navy into it because of Doris Miller.
Yeah.
So when I was going through boot camp, there's a part at the very end where you do a 24-hour straight exercise and you're just utterly exhausted, and it's really tough. And you're wearing a ball cap that says recruit the entire time. And when you finish that exercise successfully, they replace it with a hat that says Navy. So you're officially a sailor now. You're no longer a recruit.
Yeah.
And it sounds silly. It's a cap changing, but there's not a dry eye in the place because you've been working towards this for 2 months.
Yeah.
And you have all your shipmates there. That's what we call each other. Right?
Yeah.
And everybody's like, we're all sailors now. This is really great. So you identify as sailors, not white or black.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when I got to the Kitty Hawk, it's a big ship, and you don't identify as a sailor even anymore. You're a Kitty Hawk sailor. Yeah. And so I think this statue and Doris Miller's story can bring us together because we're all Wacoans. Mm-hmm. We're not black. We're not white.
Yeah. I mean, you've said it so well. We understood that from the very beginning. That was a major purpose in, committing to this project. We felt like it was an opportunity to pull together in a way like, Waco, the Waco community, broadly speaking, had really never done. Is it worth it? Yes, I think it's worth it. And the push will continue, particularly among African Americans here and elsewhere, to get Doris Miller a Congressional Medal of Honor.
Yeah.
I hope that day will come, and that will be a very proud day for our community as well.
Is there anything else interesting about Doris Miller that most people may not know? I mean, I really liked hearing that he didn't shoot down a single plane. I think that's pretty funny that most people don't know.
Yeah.
Anything else in your research that came up that was just interesting to you?
Well, the fact that he had a a premonition about not surviving the war. I think that's pretty interesting. He said that he eventually wanted to go into the restaurant or nightclub business out on the West Coast. He really liked shore leave on the West Coast.
Okay.
Going to the restaurants and nightclubs. And of course, they were segregated at the time. They were white nightclubs and there were black nightclubs. But he really liked the nightclub scene. He could see himself as a businessman running a nightclub.
I really like this podcast, especially when we're focusing on one person in history.
Yeah.
Because it's really good to paint a picture of who they are, like if they walk through the door, what their personality would be like. Yeah. And I feel like he would just be a stand-up guy.
Oh, you would take an instant liking to him. He was a perfect gentleman in every way. Very, very modest and respectful, but at the same time, his own person. Mm-hmm. Nothing false about him. He was very, very genuine. My dad would sometimes refer to people who show petty deceit. He couldn't stand people like that. Doris Miller was the opposite. There was no petty deceit in Doris Miller. And so, yeah, you would really like him. I think everyone would have liked him. It's too bad he didn't live. My dad lived to be 98. He died earlier this year in January. He and Doris Miller were born the same year, 1919. They lived as I said, in two different worlds. My dad joined the Navy and was stationed at Pearl. He joined the Navy for the same reason, to escape the Depression. Grew up in East Texas. Interestingly, he would say, I remember he said this many times. He would say, the good old days were terrible. The Depression was not simply economically challenging, it was demoralizing. And he would punctuate that point by saying, I served in the Navy, I survived World War II, I survived Pearl Harbor, I served with the Marines. I got shot at. I saw a lot of combat. I saw a lot of mortality. That was nothing compared to the Depression. He said, we had plenty of food to eat every day on board ship. He would say, we ate like kings, And when he became an officer, he started out as an enlisted man, but because he had a college degree, once the war started, he was promoted without receiving any training. He was just promoted on the spot, a field promotion, as they call it. Yeah, when he became an officer, he really had it like never before, but nevertheless, he saw a lot of combat. He was one of the first Americans to step foot in Japan at Nagasaki a couple of weeks after the bomb dropped. But he would say that was nothing compared to the Depression. So they had a lot in common. That's my point. Doris Miller had a lot in common, but they lived in segregated worlds, worlds apart. My dad came out of the Navy. He had the world by the tail. He had all kinds of opportunities. But despite the slow but steady progress of the civil rights movement, someone like Doris Miller would not have had the opportunities that my dad had. Yeah. And my dad took advantage of those opportunities. I think, historians are all about context. We not only like to tell stories, we like to make arguments, like to reach conclusions. We're interested in people, individual people. We're interested in groups of people. But most of all, to find meaning in history, we're interested in context. How do things fit in? How do things relate to one another? That's absolutely crucial to understanding Doris Miller. You have to understand Doris Miller and his world to fully appreciate him.
And I think the book does that. I mean, it connects the long life of Doris Miller and what it's meant.
Yeah, the legacy, the ongoing impact.
And we're still realizing that.
That's right.
Yeah. So I want to mention the book again. It's our co-author T. Michael Parrish. The book is Doris Miller, Pearl Harbor and the Birth of the Civil Rights Movement. It's a Texas A&M Press book. Came out last year, 2017, and it's available where all good books are available. I know you can get it at Texas A&M Press and on Amazon.
You can go to the Evil Empire Amazon and then buy it more cheaply than it's advertised on the A&M Press website for sure.
We'll strike that. I want to thank you, Mike, and thank you, Dr. Parrish, for being with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
my pleasure indeed.
That's a wrap.
That was great.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Waco.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. We'll see you next time.
Time ago, as he dropped the guns that she hated in the muddy Brazos below. Cross the Brazos at Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos at Waco, I'll walk straight in old San Antone. Then the night came alive with gunfire. He knew that at last it'd been found. As the ranger's badge showed brightly, El Bandito lay on the ground. Carmela knew he was dying, that all of her dreams were in vain. As she kissed his lips for the last time, she heard him whisper again. Cross the Brazos at Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos at Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antone. I'm safe when I reach San Antone.